Michael Jackson used to say that when he needed someone to share his deepest secrets with, he'd turn to Diana Ross.
At 81, Diana Ross lives far from the glitter and grandeur her legend suggests. What does life really look like for the Queen of Motown when the stage lights dim? Many suspect her reality is far heavier than the glossy magazine covers ever revealed. In this story, we uncover the hidden costs of fame that shaped her later years. Through court records, news footage, memoirs, and insider accounts, we'll retrace her rise, the Supremes' fractures, secret romances, tragedies, public stumbles, and the lonely calm that remains. Quiet rooms, loud memories. Diana Ross is now 81, a woman who once commanded arenas, television screens, and the bright lights of Broadway. Yet today, her life feels much smaller, quieter, and more private than fans would ever expect from the so-called Queen of Motown. She no longer thrives in the whirlwind of constant publicity. Instead, she has retreated into a more sheltered existence, keeping her circle tight, appearances limited, and her schedule far more controlled than it was during her decades of dominance. To many, this looks like a natural slowing down, but to those who follow her story closely, it feels like more than age. It is a protective response to years of scars and wounds left behind. Ross has always been fiercely conscious of her image. In her youth, this meant demanding the spotlight, ensuring she stood front and center, and cultivating a presence that could never be overlooked. But in her later years, that same instinct has worked in reverse. By limiting her exposure, by curating her moments in public, she has tried to preserve the mystique while shielding herself from scrutiny. Her appearances at concerts or special events are carefully orchestrated, brief, and rarely followed by interviews. The woman who once craved attention now seems cautious of it, a sign of both wisdom and weariness. The reasons are easy to understand when you consider the life she's lived. For decades, Diana Ross's name was linked to triumph and turbulence in equal measure. The brilliance of her music and films was often undercut by whispers of ambition, broken friendships, failed marriages, and the personal storms that never left her alone. Even the most dazzling applause could not erase the pain of betrayal or the embarrassment of her most public lows. Long after headlines fade, those emotional residues remain. And for someone like Ross, who built an empire on image and sound, the quiet aftermath can feel deafening. There are reminders everywhere. Memories of broken bonds with the Supremes, the pain of Florence Ballard's downfall and early death, the complicated history with Berry Gordy, and the humiliation of her second marriage ending on live television. Then came the arrests, the mugshot that splashed across newspapers, and the whispers about drinking and rehab. Each chapter left an impression. And while Ross has managed to rise from setbacks time and again, the weight of so many trials is not easily lifted. Her present life reflects the burden of those experiences. She carries them not with visible bitterness, but with a kind of guarded fragility that tells its own story. And so, the tension emerges. Diana Ross's legacy is immense. She is one of the most well-known performers of the 20th century, a spinning record and a cultural linchpin. Yet her present life seems less significant than a massive edifice of legacy would suggest. That being said, even in death, Diana will continue to live on in the hearts of her admirers as a giant icon, however so a symbol of success, and a pathfinder into what Black female stardom might look like. Seen from the lens of insiders, what is perceived is actually a very low-key existence, marked by loneliness, deep reflections, and unavoidable weight of memory.
I have an opportunity to, at that moment, to say something maybe of value in that work. So it really is, it's a beautiful work.
This contrast between the massive public pedestal and the shrunken private world makes Diana Ross's later years really sad. It is not just a function of time, but of how much that time slice of her energies has had to be spent on surviving loss, heartache, and scandal. For fans who always imagined their idol living in endless glamour, It is difficult to reconcile this private reality with the once glamorous parties, sparkling premieres, and whirlwind tours that have disappeared, leaving only the small routine and carefully managed appearances. And little in this present makes sense until you understand the very beginning, the name that made her who she was, not by choice, but by accident. The name that chose her. The story of Diana Ross begins with a mistake, a clerical slip that transformed Diane Ernestine Earl Ross into Diana. When her birth certificate was typed up in March 1944 in Detroit, someone struck the wrong key. What could have been corrected with the stroke of a pen was instead left as it was. Her parents didn't fight it, and so Diane became Diana. For many, it might have been an inconvenience, a story told only at family gatherings. But for Ross, the name became destiny. It carried a polish, a resonance, and an elegance that seemed to point her toward the stage before she even knew what fame was. Names have power, and in entertainment, they can be everything. They shape how the public perceives an artist long before the first song or performance is judged. Diane Ross might have been too common, too soft, too forgettable. Diana Ross, on the other hand, carried the weight of queens, of goddesses, of someone larger than life. Even at a young age, Ross seemed to understand the advantage. She accepted it, leaned into it, and allowed Diana to become a mask, an identity that promised more than her surroundings might have suggested. The power of that name cannot be overstated. In a city like Detroit, where hard work and survival defined most lives, having a name that sounded destined for stardom mattered. When Ross introduced herself as Diana, people took notice. There was a certain sparkle, an aura of possibility. Neighbors, teachers, and eventually music executives remembered it. The syllables rolled off the tongue with authority, standing out even among the crowded streets and bustling neighborhoods. The name shaped how she was seen, and eventually, how she saw herself. It gave her confidence to carry herself with poise long before success arrived. That confidence grew into something unmistakable. Ross didn't just bear a glamorous name, she lived up to it. Even as a girl, she presented herself with a kind of precision that suggested she was always rehearsing for a bigger stage. Classmates recalled that she was particular about her appearance, her speech, and her presence. Where others stumbled, she steadied herself. Where others blended into the crowd, she demanded to be noticed. Teachers and peers might not have known it at the time, but Ross was rehearsing the art of being a star. She had already begun to embody the aura that Diana suggested. By the time she was a teenager, that identity was inseparable from who she was becoming. Diana Ross wasn't just a name on a piece of paper, it was a brand, a calling card. She carried it into auditions, rehearsals, and eventually into Motown's halls. In an industry that often dismisses young black women, her name was a kind of armor. It opened doors before she sang a note, and once she did, the name attached itself to a voice and a presence that no one could ignore. Of course, no name alone could have made Ross the legend she became. But in the brutal climb of entertainment, every advantage mattered. That accidental name gave her a head start, a unique identity that sounded destined for marquee lights.
So if you didn't get a chance here in NYC, don't worry, the 80-year-old legend's not stopping. Told a packed Brooklyn theater, quote, "I'm never going to retire."
It's why so many later said that fate had chosen her. Long before she had the chance to choose for herself, she embraced it, owned it, and wielded it with precision. And as her career unfolded, Diana Ross became more than an identity. It became a cultural landmark, a name etched into music history. That name, however, was not shaped in a vacuum. It was sharpened and defined by the world around her, a Detroit neighborhood where dreams and hardship lived side by side. Detroit Heat, Diamond Will. By the early 1960s, Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard were fighting to be heard. They had knocked on Berry Gordy's door at Motown Records, begged for a chance, and even recorded under small labels just to get noticed. Still, nothing seemed to work. The Supremes, then dismissed as the no-hit Supremes, struggled with flop after flop. 8 singles in a row went nowhere, and whispers began to spread that maybe they weren't cut out for stardom after all. For most groups, it would have been the end. For Diana Ross, it was just the prelude to a breakthrough that would change everything. That breakthrough came with a song they didn't even want. In 1964, Motown handed them Where Did Our Love Go?, a track that had already been rejected by another group, the Marvelettes, who thought it was too childish. The Supremes weren't thrilled either. Mary Wilson reportedly wanted to refuse it, but Motown insisted. Diana Ross stepped up to sing it, and the recording session turned into lightning in a bottle. With its steady beat, catchy hook, and Diana's distinct delivery, the song had something no one expected. Released in June, it soared to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, staying there for 2 weeks. The girls who couldn't buy a hit had suddenly redefined the charts. The impact was seismic. Where Did Our Love Go? Wasn't just their first hit. It was the beginning of a streak no one could ignore. The Supremes went on to score 5 consecutive #1 singles, an unheard-of accomplishment for a girl group in the 1960s. Songs like Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop, In the Name of Love, and Back in My Arms Again became the soundtrack of an era. Suddenly, the no-hit Supremes were America's top girl group, rivaling even the Beatles in popularity. Diana Ross was at the center of it all. Her voice, light yet commanding, became Motown's weapon in the battle for crossover success. She could deliver emotion in a way that drew in diverse audiences, breaking barriers in a racially divided America. The Supremes weren't just making music, they were making history. On television, they appeared in elegant gowns, perfectly choreographed, offering an image of beauty and sophistication that reshaped how the world saw black women in popular culture. To millions of fans, they were proof that success could come from the most unlikely places, even the projects of Detroit.
Diana Ross rose to stardom in the female trio, then left the group in 1970 to launch a very successful solo career.
But triumph always carried a shadow. With fame came tension inside the group. Ross, already seen as Gordy's favorite, began to outshine her bandmates. She was pushed into the spotlight more and more, while Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson felt themselves fading into the background. The imbalance grew sharper when, in 1967, Motown made the controversial decision to rename the group Diana Ross and the Supremes. It was a marketing masterstroke, but a personal wound for the women who had stood beside her from the beginning. For Diana, though, the name change was both validation and warning. It confirmed that she was Motown's star, the chosen face of the future. But it also planted seeds of resentment that would eventually split the group apart. What had begun as a dream shared in the Brewster Douglas projects was now turning into a stage where one woman stood in the center and the others faded into the shadows. From rejection to record-breaking success, the Supremes' rise was one of the fastest and most dramatic in music history. And at the heart of it was Diana Ross, driven, precise, and ready to own the spotlight. Yet even as the applause thundered, the fractures within the group deepened. Behind the marquee, love and power were moving the pieces in ways the public never saw. From no hit to #1. By 1963, the Supremes were on the brink of being written off. At Motown, they were known as the No-Hit Supremes, a cruel nickname for a group that had already released a string of singles that went nowhere. They had talent, charm, and a polished look, but nothing seemed to stick. Even Berry Gordy, who saw promise in Diana Ross, was running out of patience. Then came a song that nobody wanted, Where Did Our Love Go? First offered to the Marvelettes, who dismissed it as too childish, the track landed in the Supremes' hands almost by default. None of the girls liked it. Mary Wilson and Florence Ballard were especially unimpressed, but Motown insisted they record it, and in that reluctant session, destiny was sealed. When Where Did Our Love Go hit the airwaves in the summer of 1964, it exploded. The track soared to the top of the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 2 weeks. What had seemed like just another attempt became their first #1 hit. The simple hand claps, the stomping beat created by Motown's studio crew, and Diana Ross's clean, pleading vocal transformed it into a classic. The Supremes, once mocked for failure, had cracked the code of pop success. It was more than a hit song. It was the key that unlocked the floodgates of fame. Once the breakthrough came, the hits didn't stop. Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop, In the Name of Love, and Back in My Arms Again followed in rapid succession. By 1965, the Supremes had scored 5 consecutive #1 singles, a record-breaking run that stunned the industry. Their sound was bright and infectious, their choreography sharp, their gowns dazzling. At a time when the Beatles were conquering America with the British invasion, the Supremes became Motown's answer, a homegrown powerhouse that showed the world black artists could dominate the charts too. And at the center of it all was Diana Ross. While Wilson and Ballard contributed harmonies, it was Ross's distinct voice that defined their records. With the sonic waves bending thin air, hardly anyone dared ignore her. Berry Gordy would perceive this and start building her up as the true face of the group. She was the one in the limelight, interviewed often, and dressed to stand out among others. To a cold audience, she was a cool person, with her fixed gaze and cool, indifferent, almost vacant expression towards the camera. It was not long before Diana was not just leading the Supremes, but becoming their very synonym. With the glory came a curse. The soaring fame of the group slowly pumped up backstage tensions. Formerly the loudest vocalist in the family trio, Florence Ballard became increasingly disillusioned and felt more like a shadow of herself. The dependable, true, and mild-mannered Mary Wilson sulked at having to keep silent, while Diana basked in the limelight. By 1967, the boiling point was reached between the two, while Motown officially declared the name of the group to be Diana Ross and the Supremes. To the public, the move was meant to elevate the star in marketing terms. To the 3 women, who had begun as equal partners in a united front, it was a huge wound. Already down a slippery slope, Ballard then really nosedived. Wilson felt betrayed. The unity that had carried them from Detroit's projects to global fame was fractured. For Diana, the renaming was both triumph and warning. Thus, it tied her to the crown jewel of Motown, which cost her the very people who had broken grounds for her. The tumult of applause was currently louder than ever before, but on the other side, the whispers of ambition and interest surfaced and subsided by betrayal. The Supremes crossed every record at the charts, but beneath those gowns and choreography, the fabric of their bond further hung away from respect. Behind the marquee, love and power were moving the pieces in ways the public never saw. Love, power, consequences. Diana Ross's rise to stardom wasn't built on talent alone. Behind the shimmering gowns and the perfectly orchestrated performances stood a man who shaped not only her career, but also her personal life. Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, was both mentor and gatekeeper, a visionary who saw in Ross something that others had overlooked. To the world, he was her boss, her champion, the man who pushed her to the front of the Supremes. But privately, he was also her partner. Their relationship blurred the lines between art and life, power and intimacy. By the mid-1960s, it was clear that Ross had become more than just Gordy's protege. Their closeness raised eyebrows inside Motown, and though the affair was carefully hidden from the public, insiders whispered that her rapid ascendance was no coincidence. The rumors gained weight when Ross gave birth to her daughter Rhonda in 1971. And years later, it was revealed that Gordy, not her husband at the time, was the child's biological father. This entanglement between love and business was not unique to Ross, but for her, it had lifelong consequences. Gordy's affection for her intensified his belief in her star power, which meant decisions within Motown increasingly revolved around her. From renaming the Supremes to investing heavily in her solo career, the lines between personal devotion and professional strategy became nearly impossible to separate. For Ross, Gordy was both the man who loved her and the mogul who gave her everything she had fought for. That duality was both a gift and a burden. Ross did not stop with Gordy. She had the center of a swirl in Motown, an explosion of talent, ambition, and rah-rahing. Smokey Robinson, her childhood neighbor and friend, later admitted that he and Ross had shared a secret affair during the height of the Motown industry, secretly married. There were also rumors that she was involved with Brian Holland, one-third of the triumvirate of genius songwriting behind some of Motown's biggest hits. Be they passing fancies or something more entrenched, these ties reflected the real nature of intimacy and power in the entertainment industry. Her connection with men never was, in practical view, as much as it was personal. It always had the taste of professionalism and strengthened her foothold in a very hostile world where women had to fight twice as hard for things. But whatever gains she had, it was costed by some others. Inside the Supremes, the perception that Gordy favored Ross hoked the flames of resentment. Formerly one of the key voices of the group, Florence Ballard felt more and more left out. Loyal, but on the sidelines, Mary Wilson watched their sisterhood falling apart. For them, Ross's personal choices collided with the group's unity. What had started as a shared dream in the Brewster Douglas projects
I actually grew up here in the Brewster Douglas housing project, and back in the day,
became a competition none of them had signed up for. To her bandmates, Ross's ambition sometimes looked like betrayal. To Ross herself, ambition was survival, a lifeline in an industry where stars burned brightly and then faded quickly. This tug-of-war between ambition and loyalty left scars that never fully healed. Ballard's departure from the group in 1967, followed by her tragic decline into poverty and early death, cast a shadow over Ross's legacy. Wilson, too, often spoke about the ruthlessness with which Ross pursued the spotlight. And yet, for Diana, the choices that fractured her friendships were the same choices that secured her immortality in music history. To step aside, to soften her hunger, might have meant losing everything she had fought so hard to gain. The consequences of love and power played out not only in the boardrooms of Motown, but in Ross's personal life, her friendships, and even her family. Her story during these years is a reminder of how entangled ambition and intimacy can become when the stakes are nothing less than superstardom. On the far side of success, pressure does not ease. It compounds until the seams show. Cracks behind the crown. By the time Diana Ross stood alone as a solo superstar, the world believed she had it all. Hit records, Hollywood films, glamorous tours, and a name etched into history. Yet beneath the sparkling gowns and flawless stagecraft, Ross was quietly unraveling. The relentless pace of stardom was brutal, leaving her body and mind under siege. In her memoir, she confessed to a strange, haunting symptom. She could no longer eat. Food would enter her mouth, but her jaws would lock, as though her body was rejecting nourishment itself. The more she pushed through endless rehearsals and grueling travel, the worse it became. She broke out in rashes before performances, her nerves consuming her. What should have been the height of her triumph was instead shadowed by a constant fear that someone would realize she wasn't good enough, that her success was an illusion waiting to collapse. The stress manifested in public ways, too. Decades later, her private pain spilled onto the front page. In 2002, Ross checked into rehab, reportedly paying $20,000 a month at the exclusive Promises Malibu Center. It was an attempt to regain control after years of leaning on alcohol to cope with the cracks forming behind her polished facade. But just months later, she left treatment early to return to the road, unable or perhaps unwilling to stay still while her demons lingered. That same year, she was arrested for DUI in Tucson, Arizona.
After being arrested for allegedly assaulting a female security officer who'd attempted a body search.
Her blood alcohol content was twice the legal limit. Police footage showed Ross stumbling through sobriety tests, laughing nervously, unable to recite the alphabet or even tell the correct time. The mugshot became tabloid gold, a jarring image of the Motown queen stripped of her glamour. The arrest was more than a legal issue. It was a cultural shock. For fans who had grown up idolizing her elegance, seeing Ross in such a vulnerable, compromised state was heartbreaking. She was sentenced to 2 days in jail and probation, but the damage was already done. Headlines replayed her fall from grace over and over, turning private suffering into public spectacle. Fame, which once shielded her, now fed on her pain. Ross also developed a reputation for being demanding and difficult behind the scenes, which only added to her struggles. Reports surfaced of her firing entire teams of employees, sometimes leaving careers in ruins. A scathing letter she once wrote about former staff circulated publicly, painting her as ruthless. Lawsuits followed, with some ex-employees suing her for millions, alleging mistreatment and wrongful termination. Though some suits were dismissed and others settled, the perception stuck. Diana Ross, once admired for her charm and elegance, was now branded as a diva in the harshest sense of the word. And then there was the infamous MTV Video Music Awards in 1999.
I think it's the new Supremes. Oh my goodness.
On live television, Ross walked on stage and, in a moment that stunned audiences, jiggled rapper Lil' Kim's exposed breast. Some viewers laughed, others cringed, and the clip became one of the most replayed moments in VMA history. It kept Ross in the headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. The incident reinforced the idea that she could no longer control her image, that the elegance of her Supremes days had been replaced with unpredictable, sometimes embarrassing behavior. What made these cracks even more tragic was how preventable they might have been if Ross had been able to step back, rest, and seek support without the eyes of the world on her. But the machine of fame rarely allows breathing room. For Ross, every stumble became fuel for gossip, and every mistake added weight to the crown she wore. And then the losses, the kind no tour, no trophy, no applause can make whole again. Loss, legacy, and the afterglow. No matter how gilded a life may look from the outside, it is often marked by loss. And Diana Ross's later years were no exception.
Diana Ross, the music icon, just played 2 sold-out shows right here in New York. So if you didn't get a chance here in NYC.
The shadows she carries are not from the stage lights, but from the people she lost along the way. The first and perhaps most painful wound was the downfall and early death of Florence Ballard, her friend and fellow Supreme. Ballard, once a vital part of the group's harmony, spiraled after being forced out. Poverty, depression, and alcohol took their toll, and in 1976, she died at just 32 years old. For Ross, the news was devastating. At Ballard's funeral, some mourners even booed Ross, blaming her for Florence's fate. Yet photographs captured her holding Ballard's youngest child, her face etched with grief. It was a moment that showed how complicated their bond had been, built on music, scarred by rivalry, but tied together forever. Tragedy struck again in 1996, when Ross's brother, Arthur T-Boy Ross, and his wife were brutally slain in Detroit, suffocated with plastic bags and left undiscovered for weeks. Their deaths were a chilling reminder of how quickly life can collapse into horror. Ross was on tour in Japan at the time and could not attend the funeral in person. She sent her daughter to read a letter instead, expressing sorrow and heartbreak over her brother's choices and the path that had led him to such a violent end. The guilt of not being there haunted her, a reminder that fame often demanded her absence at the moments that mattered most. Then came the blow of losing her second husband Arne Ness in 2004. Though they had divorced years earlier, Ross had called him the love of her life. Ness, a wealthy shipping magnate and mountaineer, fell to his death during a solo climbing expedition in South Africa. For Ross and their 2 sons, the news was crushing. She later described the day as one of the hardest in her life, a grief compounded by the fact that their love story had already unraveled so publicly. His death left a hole that time never fully filled. Even beyond her family and friends, Ross was pulled into another loss that tested her heart: the death of Michael Jackson in 2009. The world was stunned when his will was revealed. If Jackson's mother could not care for his children, custody would pass not to another family member, but to Diana Ross. For Ross, the revelation was a shock. Though she and Jackson had once been inseparable, collaborating on The Wiz and appearing together at countless events, they had drifted apart in later years. She declined the guardianship, insisting the children were best kept within their family. It was a decision that reflected her complicated place in Jackson's world. Cherished as a mentor and maternal figure, yet distant enough that she chose privacy over spectacle. Yet for all the heartbreak, Ross's life in later years was not defined solely by loss. There were also moments of quiet triumph. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, she had performed his words on national television, and in 1981, she helped organize a tribute concert at the National Mall. Her activism, though understated, revealed her awareness of history and her desire to contribute to it. More privately, she remained devoted to her 5 children, often speaking of them as her greatest achievement. The glamorous public life may have faded, but in her family she found purpose and a sense of grounding. In her quieter moments, Ross has admitted to feeling loneliness, a byproduct of both her single motherhood and her retreat from constant fame. But she has also embraced solitude as a kind of peace, a chance to reflect on a life lived at an extraordinary pace. The stage is not what it once was, the headlines not as frequent, yet the legacy remains untouchable. If this pulled back the curtain on a story you thought you knew, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us, which chapter of Diana Ross's life surprised you most? And keep watching the next video on your screen for more untold journeys behind the spotlight.